to ensure that we can answer some of those questions that you might have. So with that, welcome to the last of our Get Growing webinar series. I'm going to turn my video on just briefly so you can see who your instructor is, and I will turn it back off and turn it back on at the end. My name is McCarty. I'm a local foods and small farms extension educator, and I work with University of Illinois Extension, and I serve the Daviess, Stephenson, and Winnebago counties. So this is in Northern Illinois. This covers Rockford, Elizabeth, as well as Freeport, our main office locations. I know that there are folks joining this call from other places in the state, and that's just to give you some context of where I'm speaking from. My main area of expertise is working with fruit and vegetable growers that sell directly to consumers through orchards, farmers markets, and pick your own. But I also work a lot with homeowners, backyard growers, community gardens, and so forth when it comes to kind of growing those fruits and vegetables and some of the challenges that you face when it comes to growing them as well. So for tonight's presentation, this has been a topic that is always mentioned in our evaluations. There's always a request for an entire session on weed management. And I'll be upfront that I've been very hesitant to cover it because it is a topic that I'm still learning a lot about. I am very much a insects, disease, soil guy, and a kind of area of expertise is within that extension. And weed management, weed ID, that's kind of a new area for me. So it was a very exciting project to be able to place together a presentation that I hope you will get a lot out of tonight. And we can, so in some ways, learn a lot as we go along tonight with tonight's presentation, if you will, too. So I will be speaking a bit from Planting Zone 5B. This may not have too much relevancy for tonight's presentation, but just know that, you know, if you're in a different planting zone, you might be seeing weed species that are much different, or you may have been seeing some weed species much earlier than what we have been encountering in Northern Illinois. I think what you're going to find with tonight's presentation is that when it comes to the management practices, you're probably pretty familiar with what those recommendations are. And when it comes to managing certain weeds, you may find that there's great limitations or you have many options for them. I think what we also have to recognize with weed management in the vegetable garden is that there are certain things you're able to do if it was an area that was ornamental or wooded or the lawn. And yet because we're growing vegetables, because we're growing a crop we're going to eat, there can sometimes be some limitations here. So just to kind of lay the groundwork, if you will, when it comes to this sort of topic. What I've tried to do tonight is to get into some of those basics, get into the weeds, if you will, which is the terrible joke. I'm sorry I even started this off that way. And talk about characteristics of weeds, approaches to weed management, getting some of the ideas of, you know, what is a weed, maybe what isn't a weed, and how you might begin to approach it from a vegetable garden perspective. We'll get into a lot of weed identification resources because that's going to be really helpful when it comes to you determining if you have a major weed problem or if you need to do something different, or if it is that you thought it was this weed and yet it's an entirely different species than what it actually is. So we'll share some resources that we utilize in the Extension office and we provide to you. We'll finally get into the main part of tonight, which is really the strategies for weed control, discussing prevention, discussing management, covering some of those topics such as mulching, herbicides, some of those main pieces that we hope can address the weed problems that you're encountering now or you might be encountering in the next couple of months. And then I want to end tonight going through a couple of maybe more common weed species that you might be seeing in your vegetable garden or have encountered previously, and what are some strategies that there are to address those weed populations, as well as covering some of those spring weeds, some of those weeds that have already started to flower or already kind of started to show up in, you know, a freshly tilled vegetable garden, if you will. You'll see a lot of photos of weeds in my growing area. As I've shared with some of you all, I purchased a house 2 years ago and it has multiple areas to grow, ornamentals, vegetable gardens, and so forth. but it also means that there's an entire new understanding of the weed population that I have. So I spent some time trying to ID a lot of these weeds, if you will. So let's get going with the definition. And you see this definition quite a lot from R.W. Emerson when you look through documents related to weed management, and even when you see some of the master gardener literature out there too. And at the crux of it, it's a plant whose virtues have yet to be determined. It is true that, certainly this weed might be that you have already determined its virtues. You've determined that you don't want it. That's the main thing. And yet it may be that someone else sees that plant differently. It could be that they see it as having a much different virtue than perhaps you have. But that's a very very broad idea of what a weed is. Furthermore, we might think that it's unwanted. We might consider that it's a nuisance based on where it's growing. We might also see from a vegetable garden perspective, it's taking up resources. It's taking up space, it's taking up soil nutrients. It's causing some problems when it comes to the vegetables I'm trying to grow. From a vegetable garden perspective as well, it's competing with other plants. It could be that they're growing right beside each other, right beside your tomato plants or your corn or some of those other vegetables that you're trying to grow. And they're taking up valuable resources, whether it's water, sunlight, soil nutrients, but it's doing something with competition. It could also be that it's out of place or, realistically, it's not intentionally planted. Perhaps this plant would be fine in another location on your property, and yet because it's in the vegetable garden or because it's in that area that you don't want it to be, it's really out of place. As I was weeding one of my gardens last week in an ornamental bed, I started to notice that there's lots of seedlings from a tree that hangs over this ornamental garden area. So certainly those little seedlings are out of place. They would be fine in another location of my property, but because they're in an ornamental garden of growing my daffodils and my tulips, they're out of place in my opinion. You might also encounter volunteer plants. We certainly know those that create compost and then put compost into the garden. Sometimes those plants from the previous season start to germinate. And you've got those volunteer plants that maybe are taking up space, or maybe they would be fine in another location. Some additional characteristics that we might consider. We might consider that it has undesirable qualities that just really outweigh the good. Perhaps it's a plant that has a tendency to just really take over the garden or take over space that you don't really like. Perhaps it is one that tends to be kind of a bit more with vining characteristics and spreads to other parts of your garden. And it's that one characteristic that's really keeping the plants from being healthy and really thriving. At the end of the day, it's a plant growing where it is not wanted, very simply. And it could very well be that when I see a plant growing in this vegetable garden, you might see that it's fine. You might find that it could be wanted and certainly, could be fine in your own garden. I also think it's important to consider that, the definition may vary due to location. So it could very much be that the plant that's in this wooded area, but now that it's in an ornamental bed, is now what I would classify as a weed, or what you might classify as a weed. A plant growing in your lawn compared to growing in a vegetable garden might be a very similar situation too. So the definition could be entirely different. I think it's also important to realize that it's an almost expected part of your ecosystem. It's very rare, very, very rare to have a weed-free vegetable garden. It's very, very common that there's going to be weeds in the garden, and that's kind of expected. That tends to be expected in most cases. This is curly dock, which you see here. This is one that's just started to appear the last couple of weeks. And as you can tell, it's very much in a location that I don't want it to be. It's found this one little niche in between a concrete slab and the wood barrier that I have in place. And it's been able to just narrow in right there, get the resources that it needs, and create a very large weed. As we think about weed ID, and we will get into more of these weed ID resources, you will sometimes find that it can be very narrow, that the discussion will now get more into characteristics that we commonly see that are problems with the weeds. And that will be some of what we'll talk about tonight when it comes to these plants. Weeds are notorious for producing large seed quantity. That's very much a great growth characteristic that they tend to have. For instance, dandelions, that typically a single dandelion that is perennial will live sometimes 10 to 12 years. And in the course of that time period, every season is going to produce annual flowers. And every annual flower, which is typically 10 per plant, will tend to produce about 150 to 200 seeds. So as you think about those kind of whitish puff balls, which have just started to go to seed in Northern Illinois, every single one of them has about 150 to 200 of these seeds. So it can be quite a lot. There's weeds such as pigweed that may have 13 to 35,000 seeds on a single pigweed plant. And these can have a wide range and produce quite a lot of these. They're very quick to establish. In most cases, a weed is very quick to get its growth in the spring or even in the summer. You saw previously with the curly dock that it has already started to grow pretty vigorous. The seeds may also stay fairly dormant for a long period of time in the soil. So they have some very long survivability compared to some other ones. This is curly dock, which you saw previously. A curly dock seed can stay in the soil for up to a decade. And be fine until it gets everything it needs to start growing and germinating. Canada thistle and some of those other thistles can also stay in the soil for up to 10 years before germinating. So they have a long life in the soil once these seeds are entering the seed bank. And certainly it could be that you did not see any issues with these weeds years ago, and now you're seeing them again, and yet the seeds were already there. They're very adaptive for spreading, as the seeds are notorious for how they spread, but also as you think of other plants and you think of something like quackgrass and how it's spreading underneath the soil pretty quickly compared to some of these other plants that you might have. Some also have vegetative reproductive structures. And so these could be those rhizomes that are underground. It could be the stolons that are above ground, right in the soil line, that are spreading out and creating more of a matted system to it. They also take advantage of us as we are out pulling weeds. They may also be inserting weed seeds into the soil. They take advantage of as we're tilling. Like any action that you're doing in your vegetable garden is potentially opening you up for more weeds to germinate, or even pulling them up closer to the soil surface where they could continue to germinate. So what's their role then in a vegetable garden? You know, certainly their role is to get what they need, right? They're going to get the nutrients they need, the sunlight, the space, the water. They're going to try to get all of those in order to grow and germinate and produce the flowers and produce the seeds if they're that type of weed. But they also are going to reduce quality of your vegetables. They may interfere with the harvest, especially as you begin to go out into your vegetable garden and begin to harvest. They may also be removing some valuable soil nutrients that your plants really need, especially as you're adding fertilizer or you're adding some compost. Certainly your weed species might be there to take up some of those good soil nutrients. One of the main areas that is a little bit troublesome with weed species is that they can host diseases. They can also host insect pests. So while you may not have thrips or aphids on some of your vegetables in your garden, they look really great and pristine, these populations of aphids and thrips could be building up in population on the corners of your vegetable garden or nearby. The same with diseases too, and just kind of waiting for the right time to move in. Furthermore, the weeds might even limit your management options. If you have such a severe population of weeds in your vegetable garden, it may mean that you don't have as many options when it comes to actually controlling these weed species. For instance, bindweed or even something like Pennsylvania smartweed is one that is notorious for having kind of a vining quality and a vining characteristic. When it comes to controlling something, especially like smartweed, Pennsylvania smartweed, mulching doesn't seem to help. So it is that I have to kind of go in there and try to pull these weeds out of the soil, because the mulching that we would normally suggest sometimes for controlling weeds doesn't tend to work too well for something like Pennsylvania smartweed. Some of these weeds have what's known as allelopathic compounds. So as these weeds are growing in the soil, they're sending compounds into the soil, and it may be inhibiting growth around these weed species, or once you pull them out of the soil, the weed that you don't want, it's leaving behind compounds in that soil that may inhibit the growth of the vegetable transplants that you might be placing into the soil. These are weeds like Canada thistle, pigweed, quackgrass. All of those can sometimes have allelopathic compounds that they send into the soil. From that perspective of diseases, of insect pests, you see a number listed here as far as hosts of diseases and insects. So common lamb's quarter will sometimes have populations of thrips, of corn earworm, aphids, flea beetles. Something like purslane would have armyworm, corn earworm would also be there, pigweed, aphids, thrips, flea beetles, and then even something like dandelion and crabgrass could host Rhizoctonia solani, which would be a more common disease that we might see on vegetables. So it can be very crucial then to really think about managing the weeds within the bed and around that growing area to, we hope, not only to control the weeds, but also to keep the insects and the disease in check. Well, there are some benefits, right? Can't really talk about a plant without yet getting back to its virtues. And that certainly there are some virtues when it comes to a weed and a plant that we might even classify as a weed. This, of course, could be some soil stabilization. A weed plant is putting its roots into the soil. It potentially is stabilizing the soil and potentially inhibiting some of the erosion that you might be encountering in certain parts of your growing area. One of the ones we really highlight early in the season, especially in the spring, is that many of these weeds will be producing a flower, which might be some of the earliest nectar for some of our pollinators. So these are things such as dandelions, which you see here. This is chickweed, which is not photoed here, but you'll see a photo of. And of course, later on, you may even have clover, henbit, and some of those others that are producing a flower that could potentially be providing nectar, and one of the first sources of nectar for our pollinators. They also are adding organic matter. They're breaking down into the soil. They're adding to that soil. And of course, many of these weed species may have some human consumption related to them. You see some photo here of dandelion. So this is my front lawn. We have a wide range of dandelion in the front lawn. I tend to approach this as a balance, that I'm letting it flower for a period of time. At a certain point, I'm trying to come in and mechanically remove these before it introduces seeds back into the soil and back into this growing area. Most of my vegetables are in the backyard. It's where my vegetable garden is. So I have a barrier that kind of keeps these from entering into the vegetable garden. Yet again, I approach it as a balance here, that I'm okay with this area with the dandelions, but I'm trying to kind of keep it from getting to my vegetable gardens in the backyard. And that may be how you approach weed management too, is a balance and an ideal balance. So as we think about what this weed species might be doing in the vegetable garden, we also may need to recognize that some of these may require kind of complete removal that is either expected or potentially even necessary. You know, there are certainly some weed species that we'll talk about tonight that have some very invasive qualities to them, or might be even classified as invasive, just based on how they establish, how they spread. We might even have some weed species that we're dealing with that are noxious, or even giving that kind of more of a nuisance to it that could be causing problems, such as Canada thistle, for instance. So it could be that you need to really think more critically about your weed species that you're dealing with in the vegetable garden, as well as other parts of your growing area, because you may find that the longer you ignore it based on its quality, based on what type it is, it could actually become a major problem for you in the next couple of years. The strategies for any sort of weed are going to depend highly on the weed itself. There may be some recommendations that we suggest may work well for one type of weed and may not work well for another. As I shared with you about Pennsylvania smartweed, which is in this prostrate knotweed family, which you see here, it has these vining type kind of characteristics. And yet when it came to actually managing it with a straw mulch, they loved it. They thrived on it. It was as if I was giving them the best home that they would have for that growing season. So the straw mulch recommendation, though, might work well for other weed species. So it's important to really think about that and really know the type. There's also sometimes, yet again, that idea of a garden variety weed versus those noxious, invasive types of weed species, where you need to certainly be on top of controlling some of them compared to maybe a garden variety one that might just be there. You know, you have a dandelion in your vegetable garden, you pick it up, you pull it out. Something like a chickweed that maybe isn't making much space, or even purslane perhaps even. So some of those where you might just be balancing out. But as I share with you, and as we share a lot tonight, it's really important to know thy enemy and really know what weed species you're potentially dealing with this season and dealing with for the next couple of years, especially as we think about what recommendations and management we might have for it. So you might also be thinking to yourself, where did this weed come from? And I think that's sometimes something that we certainly see, is that things from the previous year we thought we had a good control over, and yet this year you might have an entirely different weed population that you've never seen before. And as shared with you, the dormancy of these seeds is that they can live for quite some time. And so it could certainly be that they could be living there for quite a time period here. So they could already be present, or you certainly could be that it's found its necessary resources. Weed seeds and weed stolons or parts of the weed will come from different sources. It could be it's coming from that soil amendment, manure, compost, wood chips. I think that's where a lot of some of my problems came, so some wood chips previously. If you're doing any sort of topsoil, whether it's going into your raised beds to start off for the year, or whether you're adding it to other areas, they almost always have weed seeds in them. So you should expect that weed seeds will be in the topsoil that you will be using. And in this idea, it's being topsoil that you're purchasing and bringing in to the area. It could also be coming from plant-based mulches, straw and hay. Certainly straw, hay, we see it more often because it tends to have more seeds in it. That's just one thing we have to consider. If you're taking grass clippings and you're bringing them into the soil and into your growing area to provide a mulch layer, certainly you could be introducing weed seeds that way. That tends to be why when it comes to mechanically removing some of those dandelions with my mower, I collect them and then I'm not putting them into my vegetable garden, because I just am very concerned, of course, that I'm going to be introducing more dandelions in there. They can, of course, move in through wind, through water, with humans. Perhaps they get stuck on your shirts or things that you're wearing. They could also be moved in with animals in certain direction. And then they could already be present, and it's from a soil disturbance. You've tilled a little bit too much, you've pulled a weed out, and yet you've brought up more weeds in that way. Maybe you have an area that has quackgrass. You've come in with your tiller, and as soon as you till up quackgrass, that tends to actually sometimes cause more problems, because it's allowing for quackgrass to spread more quickly, because you've cut into the underground rhizomes. And so that's something we don't recommend. So it could be the soil disturbance that's actually doing it in some ways. So as we move into our next section about weed ID, this is one area where I would maybe encourage you, if you feel really comfortable with your insects, your diseases, your growing of vegetables and fruit, this might be the next area that you begin to learn a lot more about. And this is something certainly that I'm trying to learn a lot more about, is getting better at IDing my weeds and thinking about where my weeds are. When it comes to actually breaking down and deciding, okay, I have a weed from my backyard, what is it? What is its classification? We think a lot about starting with location. It could be if you're finding a weed and it's from a vegetable garden, that might be entirely different from a weed that might be growing underneath some trees or growing in an ornamental area of your backyard and your growing area. And then from there, we look for general physical features. One of the main ones that you're going to see a lot of is broadleaf or grass. And the broadleaf would be something like a dandelion. It would be something like a curly dock compared to a very traditional grass of quackgrass or crabgrass. Furthermore, we might even think of how is this weed actually growing? Is it standing kind of upright, like a dandelion might be, or thistle might be, versus kind of a creeping mat style that clover might have, for instance, or bindweed that has a vining kind of characteristic. There's more things that go into this. You think about how the leaves are arranged, the shape, the margins, the petioles, how is the actual stalk attaching to the leaf of that stem. And then you get into more things such as the actual spines. Does it have hair? Doesn't have hair? And then we think more about, depending on its maturity, we think about the height of the plant or the flower, the early and mature growth, all of these pieces. And this sounds very complicated, and yet it's pretty simple when I give you the resources tonight. So even you see here with some drawings I did of leaf shape or even leaf margin, you can begin to really develop this skill. And that's what I might encourage you to do, is begin to develop this skill. Some other things to share, though, is that you may need to wait for better growth. It's one thing to get some very tiny germination when the plant is just starting to get a couple of the leaves, when in fact you need some bigger growth to it. That could be one thing that's really keeping us from effectively IDing it. You may also find that to actually get a proper ID, it needs to have flowered, or it needs to have a growth characteristic that's just very distinctive for that. And then I would also say, think about the time it appeared. Was it early spring? Was it late spring, late summer, and so forth? A great example is what you see here. This is common chickweed. And I received a phone call at the end of March from one of our orchards in Rockford. And he said, oh, I've got this weed. I haven't seen it before. It's just kind of all over the place. And I'm trying to ID it. And he described its physical features to me. And then he said, it has a white flower. That distinction, that it has a white flower, also that it was early season, end of March, allowed us to now narrow it down to common chickweed, because certainly at that time of the season, very, very early, there's very few weeds that had already flowered and had already developed it. So the timing can be really helpful in helping us to understand what you're dealing with and what you're thinking about. The other piece of this I might encourage you to do for a project this next month, as well as this season and so forth, is to kind of do a bit of a weed audit. Really walk around your property, walk around your area, take photos, see where weed populations are, so that you have a better grasp and a better understanding of weed populations that may be a problem for your vegetable garden, or may be a problem and kind of inhibit what you need to do. As I've done this the last couple of weeks, there's certainly areas that I need to watch out for. I have garlic mustard, a very invasive species, weed species, in one corner of my area. I've also encountered some stinging nettle that needs to certainly be addressed. As you'll see photos tonight, there's a number of other weed species that are just kind of hanging out, which it's easy for me to actually just pull and remove. But this audit, this kind of idea of even a weed census, if you will, can give you a better grasp of what your problems currently are and what they could be in the future, and certainly areas to avoid or areas that absolutely need to be addressed. This is something that you could continue into the summer, and I would probably even stress try to do another year of it. So try to do this next year in 2022, because you could be seeing weed populations that you haven't seen previously, just based on our season. But I think you'll find some nice success with this. And certainly that's kind of what I'm doing, is going through and IDing weeds while also removing them if need be. At the same time that I kind of talked about, how you might ID a weed, there's a number of smartphone apps that are now available. And these are apps such as the iNaturalist, picture this, Seek, which is one that also, I believe, is a partnership with iNaturalist, and it includes wildlife, plant, fungi. There's also Leaf Snap. These are all photo ID apps where you take a photo of the plant and then it IDs them. One of the pieces with this is kind of nice is that it builds a library or builds a garden. So you have the ability to go back and look and see what this weed was or what this plant was, because in fact, it's a plant ID app. So it really is getting into any kind of plants that are out there, not just maybe a narrow definition of what a weed species is. It allows you to kind of get an idea of what it is, but would still encourage you to double check the results. And certainly if some of these apps are listing, say, recommendations for removal or recommendations of management, we would encourage you to reach out to University of Illinois Extension for proper recommendations for Illinois and for your growing area. You may also need to narrow it down further, especially some of these where it may be that it has a very generic name and it could be one of four or multiples. So it's not always perfect. There is some cost involved for some of these. Some of them are free, some of them there's a little bit of cost available or cost required for it, but it could be a great tool to really use to help you understand more of what's growing around you. And it should be stressed that what I'm sharing here, there's no endorsement for any particular product or service. This is just to provide some education. There's two websites that you'll get links to that can also be some very good weed IDs and could help you really kind of narrow down what weed species you have. Neither of them would say allow for a submission of a photo, but it could allow you to begin to properly ID what that weed species is. This is University of Missouri's Weed Key. I took a screenshot of what this looks like here, and you can see that it's very similar to what we think about when it comes to weed or plant ID keys, where you're starting out here, determining whether it's a broadleaf or a grass, and then that begins to narrow down to leaf arrangements, characteristics, and so forth. At the side to the right, it will begin to narrow these down further for you. I think one of the pieces of caution is that you may find that the plant that you want to have ID'd is not by definition a weed. You yourself, of course, are saying that this is a weed, I've got a weed problem, and yet the way that these are designed, they are giving a name, if you will, to weeds and saying that this is a weed. So you may not find your plant in there because they don't consider it a weed, but you do. It is one that I think works well, and I've had a couple of experiences kind of working through it. You can see here curly dock, which you've seen a photo of tonight already. So once I've decided that it's curly dock, it gets into different things such as the weed descriptions, the leaves itself and the structure, to in some ways just check off that what you have said it actually is. But one of the areas I really like is this area of identifying characteristics. So it will actually say that, you know, this is curly dock, but it might look a little bit similar to broadleaf dock. But the reason that it's not that is based on these features. So that can be a very helpful piece in helping you determine what the weed species is that you're dealing with. University of Minnesota also has a weed ID section. You can see here that theirs really starts out with more photo-based. So it is that you have to determine whether it's a broadleaf, a grass, a sedge, wood, woody. It even gets into moss as well. And very similar to how University of Missouri's is, it is one that has also already somewhat defined what they would classify as a weed. So they're only starting off with, say, 3 to 400 species that they classify as weeds, and yet you may not. Yours may be a plant, but they don't consider it a weed. You see here too, like they'll go into things such as a grass, so a very nice kind of visual selection to IDing your weed and can really kind of help with this. They don't have as many recommendations as far as management. And I also find, especially with theirs, that you may still need to narrow things down just a little bit further. We still sell this book in our University of Illinois Extension office. This is Weeds of the North Central States book. It's a very good resource. It's a little bit older, as you can kind of see here, and yet it's one that can help when it comes to weed ID and classifications. So very good overview of very common weeds. I think the main challenge here is that there's no color photos. So you almost have to go in with a fairly good grasp and a fairly good comfort level of your identification with it. And it's a little more heavy sometimes and a little bit more dry, if you will. So on to some of our best practices when it comes to weed management in the vegetable garden. I would say, like, if you step back from what your objectives are when it comes to managing weeds properly, you really want to consider how can you keep this weed species from receiving water, sunlight, space, and nutrients. Is there a way that you could alter your growing situation so that they no longer have it? And it could be that you're mulching to keep them from getting water or sunlight. It could be that you're mowing parts of those weeds down and then covering with, say, a heavy tarp or plastic that's going to basically force some of those perennial weeds to utilize a lot of their carbohydrates in the soil that they have in their soil parts. But how could you reduce it? How could you really alter that? It's also important to recognize that in the backyard, in that vegetable growing area, there's a strong chance that you have a mixture of annual, perennial, and even biennial weed species. Biennial being ones that would take 2 years in order to develop flowers or develop their seeds. And each of those can be a little different when it comes to what those best practices are. So it's really important, yet again, to really ID those weeds in order to then determine what your practices are going to be. And at the end of the day, what we can really encourage you at University of Illinois Extension is having proper ID equals proper management, which equals weed control. I don't want you to waste your time pursuing a management strategy that's not going to work well for an annual plant, or it's not going to work well for a perennial weed that you're trying to get under control. It's very important to have this proper ID so that we then determine what your best strategies are going to be. So yet again, we think about what those weeds traits are. What types of flowers is it producing? How is it spreading? What is the growth characteristics that we expect to see during the growing season and after? Something like garlic mustard, which has an entirely different appearance in its first year of growth compared to its second year of growth. Having those traits is really important. And how does it spread? How does it move? Focus highly on prevention, keeping the weeds from germinating, keeping them from the seeds from entering into the soil where they could stay for 10, 20 years, if not longer, and even try to, reduce the ability for seed flower development to occur, especially if it's one of those weeds that is going to do that. I would also stress, make this a part of your garden interaction. If you're out there planting tomatoes in the next couple of weeks, try to also remove some weeds by hand or put some mulch down. If you're out there trellising tomatoes, also pull some weeds. Make weed management a part of your daily interaction or every other day interaction with your vegetable garden. And this can really put you on the right path when it comes to this. And as always, very multiple strategies for multiple weeds. You see this photo here. This is one of our raised beds in Joe Davis County at the Extension office. And certainly have a mixture of different weed species in there, some of which are perennial, some of which are annual. And, at this stage, probably need to really consider managing that. While I was visiting, of course, I pulled some of these weeds too, which might be the main strategy that we do at this time. But have different approaches, and that kind of gets back to the weed audit of knowing what weed species you're really dealing with here. One thing I do want to bring up is that one of the ways that weeds can germinate very quickly is if you're watering the entire garden. it's very important for vegetables to just water at the base of the plant. There's no reason for you to water the entire garden. There's no reason for you to water the entire plant. Watering right at the base where those roots of the vegetables are will help when it comes to controlling weeds and keeping them from getting the water that might be provided to them, but also help quite a bit with disease pressure and keeping disease from spreading. So watering right at the base of the plant, and typically we also recommend water at the base of the plant as needed in the morning. So do it in the morning compared to the evening. But this is just one step that can be a way to just already keep the weeds from getting the resource that they might need. It's also important to recognize that these first 45 days are really crucial, and we consider these 45 days at planting. So, if you've already started a cool season vegetable, the clock is ticking, if you will. As soon as there's any kind of soil disturbance and you've tilled your soil up or you've started to plant, this is that first 45 days where it's really crucial to start removing any of those weeds if they start to germinate, any of those bigger weeds that have already started to develop seeds, such as our dandelions here. Really zero in on the first 45 days to ensure that weed management is really taken out over control. You may encounter, depending on that weed, that a combination of actions repeated long-term may be necessary. For some of these weed species that might be perennial weeds, it might be advantageous that you continue to apply, say, an herbicide, and you have to keep applying that every couple of weeks or every month in order to keep those weeds in control. You may find that because of the severity of your weed population, that you need to continue to lay down mulch to keep weeds from germinating and keep weeds from growing. Now, I recognize that it's one thing that everything goes great and you've got it under control the first 45 days, but I certainly know that things get away from us. And certainly we might expect that this summer things might get away with us. And perhaps you have a lot of weed population that is now really germinated and it's growing and it's kind of taken over the garden. The one thing that we would really try to stress, especially if it's a weed that's going to produce a flower and produce seeds in that season, is to try to keep them from entering in that soil. So it is that if worse comes to worse and it's hard for you to pick the weeds and to remove the weeds, try to really go after those flowers and keep them from developing seeds and keep them from entering the soil. Now, of course, there may be some weeds that will move a different way, and they may have stolons and runners above ground. They may also be moving underground with their rhizomes. So certainly those may be a little bit harder to control, some of those grasses. But if it's a weed population that is producing flowers and potentially going to produce seeds, try to get in there and cut them off and remove them before they enter the soil, because it's just going to be a long time of them potentially staying in the soil. So let's talk about some of these prevention measures then. Certainly cultivation practices are things to really consider. And I know that some folks are probably not going to do any type of tilling, but I also recognize that it's kind of expected to do tilling every year. And that's certainly okay, either of those directions you want to go. You do need to recognize that any sort of tilling that happens is potentially going to move weed seeds up to the soil surface, and it's then going to allow them to germinate. You may also find that this disturbance is now going to provide an area for weeds to move in even. So you provide a great area for this. So if you're doing something such as you're prepping your beds, say 3 to 4 weeks before planting, start to really control those weeds as they emerge, going out there with any hand tools, ensuring that as they're germinating, you're removing them. Because yet again, that 45 days is really crucial to really be mindful of it. So as you see with this gentleman who has come through and tilled, certainly, that 45 days from tilling is where I'm going to be very active to make sure that these weeds are not germinating, or that if they are, I'm going to remove them from there. And it could be also a great time to really, you've tilled, you come in with a mulch layer, and then when you actually plant your transplants or you plant some of your other vegetables that are direct seeded, you're just pulling back from that row, putting the plant in and then covering it again, if it's a transplant. Or if it is direct seeded like peas, I'm pulling back the mulch and putting my peas in there. And then after they've germinated, after maybe a week or two, then I might pull that mulch back. But it's really important to do this. Certainly steps like reduced tilling, where maybe you're just going to dig into one certain area of that growing area, would be a strategy. Even something like lasagna gardening, where you're just continually layering on top and layering each season, could also help quite a bit and really prevent weeds from being a problem. One of the other pieces to consider is the actual vegetables you're growing. I would still stress to use recommended spacing for plants. My concern is that if you plant them too close together to address weed control and prevent weeds from germinating, you also might be leading to more disease problems down the road. So it's really outweighing that action. And that's why I would encourage you to keep the spacing as is. However, you may find that you could alter a resource the weeds really need. It could be that you're coming in with a mulch layer around where your vegetables are growing. You see here with my squash plants, I have an area that is extremely exposed. I should have come in there and potentially put some mulch down to keep that from being a great place for weeds to germinate. I think you might also consider that there's going to be some vegetables that are really great competition against weed species, and there's some that are very poor competition. For instance, squash, corn, cabbage, broccoli, those all tend to be very strong competitors against most weed species. It of course depends on the weed, but I would say that they're very good, strong competitors once they get started and once they get growing. And some of the weeding that you might need to do is just kind of around that area. The poor performers tend to be lettuce, something like peppers even, carrots, peas, onions. Those tend to be very poor performers and poor competitors against weed populations and weed species. So having that in mind can really help you think more critically about your weed population and how you need to manage it based on whether the vegetable is going to do really well or you need to make sure the weeds are not growing and germinating nearby. So one common preventative measure we would recommend would be some sort of organic mulch. And when I use the term organic mulch, know that this is discussing a product that is going to address weed control, but it's also going to break down to the soil. So you would still want to keep reapplying perhaps during the season, while also recognizing that probably next year you would need to do another layer. So every season you would be putting more organic mulch. Realistically, it's trying to remove one of those resources. It's trying to keep water from getting to the weeds to germinate, and certainly it's trying to get sunlight away from the weeds to germinate too. These could be things such as grass clippings, though I find that grass clippings can become fairly matted, so kind of keep that in mind with some of what you might be using. Straw mulch could be utilized, although it can sometimes introduce those weed species. Wood chips is what you see here in our Joe Davis County office, where they have placed them right around our strawberry beds and is working really well for weed control early on this season. Of course, you see a little bit of either henbit or creeping Charlie, ground ivy rather, there around the base of that cinder block. Newspapers, cardboard, those could also work really well for this kind of mulch layer that you want to place. I would encourage you to avoid sawdust. The reason for sawdust avoidance is that it tends to sometimes pull nitrogen from the soil, and it tends to make it unavailable for your plants to take up. So it's just a very heavy one that, while it could certainly address weed control, I worry that it may also affect your plants and the nutrients that they need from the soil. And as I share with you, these may work for some weeds, they may not work for all weeds. And certainly you may need additional application as needed. Some of these you might look to have really heavy layers, sometimes 2-3 inches might be very, very good to do here. Plastic mulch, landscape fabric, those would all be great for utilizing, and certainly as a preventative measure, that might be the strategy you look at. You may need irrigation line if you're doing any sort of kind of plastic mulch, especially something that might be staying in place. Certainly a landscape fabric could really be put in place, but it may just be better for garden prep. So maybe that season before is where you might use this very heavy duty landscape fabric instead of actually planting into it. Usually with a plastic mulch, we see about a 1 season use for it. I think if you kept a landscape fabric in place for many years, the problem you might encounter is some limited crop rotation, just based on if the holes would be a particular size. And yet again, highly dependent on weed species. You're going to hear, you've heard that a lot already. You'll hear that more tonight. Some other things to mention here that may be more management during the season. Certainly hand tools, some of those standard hoes, those shuffle hose or scuffle hose, those work really well for removing some of these weed species. You just want to make sure you're not doing too much disturbance, and you also want to make sure that you're not doing too much plant damage, or you're not doing any plant damage, I should say. And for some of the weed species, this may not be effective. You know, something like a weed species that is perennial, you may just be removing the annual part of it, and yet the perennial part of it that's going to keep coming back is still in the soil. So the hand tool, unless you're actually digging it out, may be ineffective for this. And would still say avoid placing these in the compost unless you're just extremely certain that that weed species is not going to introduce any seeds back into the soil. Mowing could be a strategy, especially if things get really bad, or some of the perennial plants, the recommendations can sometimes be to mow them with either a mower or say a weed whacker. And then you might come in and combine that with herbicide, or even combine that with mulch to really get the bed in place. And so that would be a strategy that might be pretty effective getting a new growing area in place. Two additional ones that might be, long-term thinking is soil solarization. This is a method that we see on many vegetable farms. This is a strategy that's used to address very heavy weed infestation of growing areas. In this situation, it's a fairly non-chemical approach to addressing weed severity. The only challenge is that you need to utilize clear plastic. Don't want to use black plastic, and it also needs to be a double layer here. The issue here is that this needs to occur usually mid-August in Northern Illinois. In other parts of the state, you might be able to get away with this a little bit later, maybe even Labor Day, but because of the way that our temperatures are in Northern Illinois, you need to utilize this method the season before in about mid-August for this to work. And yet again, it needs to be clear plastic. Black plastic does not tend to actually kill these weeds. But the idea being is that the weeds are germinating and then they're being killed underneath this plastic. Cover crops could also be utilized. We see this on a large scale sometimes, corn, soybean growers, and yet cover crops could be utilized in raised beds or in vegetable garden areas in order to address weed populations. This would be great in the fall, where you could do something like cereal rye, wheat, or something there that would just be able to kind of close that fallow period. It would not necessarily do well to, say, outcompete established weed populations or address perennial weed populations, but it could be there to really close that fallow period. Cereal rye is a great example. Sometimes clovers, although clovers can have some weedy, kind of invasive tendencies. So on to herbicides then. This is an area that we do get questions about when it comes to utilizing in the vegetable garden area. And it's important to recognize that very few are actually labeled for vegetables that are either already planted or already are in a stage of a lot of growth already. There's an area here where you may find that many of the ones that are available are potential for garden prep the year before. So it could be you have an area that you want to plant in. It's one of your few areas but it has heavy infestation of perennial weeds. And it could be in the fall that's when you're actually addressing that perennial population in order to get the weeds under control and the bed ready to be planted the next spring. Now, that being said, there are certainly ones that are listed and allow you to target the weed, and then you could plant in a couple of days, sometimes even a couple of weeks, depending on it. But it may not work for both annual and perennial, is typically sometimes what we see with some of these herbicides that I'll mention tonight. You also have those that are selective versus non-selective. So it's targeting a particular type, whether it's broadleaf or it's a grass weed, versus those that are non-selective, meaning that whatever it comes into contact with, it's going to kill, it's going to hurt, which could be ornamentals that you like nearby, or even some of those vegetables that you might even be growing. There are those that are systemic, and so they are being absorbed by the plant and absorbed into the root system. We see these really commonly for perennial vegetables, or rather perennial weeds, not perennial vegetables. And there's contact. You're applying the herbicide all over that weed, and it's through this contact that it's killing it. Usually contact is more common for annual weeds. You also see pre versus post-emergent. Pre-emergent would be something that is applied to the soil to inhibit weeds from actually germinating, versus a post-emergent where the weed's already growing, I'm coming in and I'm applying the herbicide onto the actual weed plant. Some additional things to just share. There's an idea, of course, of weed control versus weed preventer. And certainly once the weeds have germinated, you're now in an area of weed control versus weed preventer, that weeds have not germinated just yet. What herbicide might be available to keep them from germinating, but also are there other methods that could prevent weed populations too, some of which we've already talked about tonight. It is so important. Please read your label. Please know what you're getting yourself into. Recognize that some of the herbicides available to you are just for lawns, or they're just for ornamentals, or there's no edibles listed whatsoever. We also encourage you to consider prevention practices, as we've talked about tonight, those preventative practices, and then really determine if you're able to apply it, and it's all going to come back to your weeds and the weed ID that you've given. You will occasionally see organic or OMRI approved, Organic Materials Review Institute, and this is to denote that this herbicide is organic or certified organic. It's important to recognize it's still a herbicide. It's important to recognize that organic herbicides can still kill the weed species, and they may also kill your vegetables. So be very mindful of that if you choose to go down that route. But that would be the label that you're looking for. An example here is ammonium non-anoate, which is basically a mixture of ammonia and acid in it. So just going to mention a couple of these. Yet again, we're not endorsing any particular product, just using these as educational purposes to share with you. So trifluralin, Treflon, this is a granular product. This is what we may consider a weed preventer. So it's being added into the soil. It's preventing weeds from germinating with it. So it's actually not going to kill the weeds that have already germinated. One thing to mention, that has no effect on existing weeds. So you can scatter it all over the weed species that have already germinated, and it's not going to kill them. It's only going to inhibit weeds from actually germinating from the soil. Results vary considerably for this type of product. It's also not to be used for beets, chard, corn, lettuce, but it is listed for use in some vegetable gardens. Here's the label that you see here. So you see it lists mainly annual weeds that are controlled, breaks it down to grass weeds, breaks it further down to broadleaf weeds as well. And then you see here the actual fruits and vegetables that it is listed for. And keep in mind that what it's stating here is that if you're growing these types of fruits and vegetables, depending on when you're growing them, you could effectively add this granular type of herbicide to address these grassy or broadleaf weeds. And here on the right is for use on vegetables, and telling you some context as far as when to use this product. Also, yet again, please remove all existing weeds. So it's not going to address it. But I would say success rate can particularly vary for this product. Something to really consider is that it may vary considerably. One of the other pre-emergents that we sometimes see and can work sometimes well for your situation is corn gluten meal. So a little bit different than the previous one. This is granular, it's added to the soil. It's listed for almost all vegetables, and it is inhibiting any weeds from germinating. I think one of the main challenges with this one is it has 10% nitrogen. And so weeds that are already established may utilize this to take up nitrogen, and now maybe you have a bigger weed problem. There's very mixed results about this product, and there is not a good consensus as far as whether it could be highly recommended. There's varying reports of it working or not working. And in fact, one of the things that they stress is a multi-year application is ultimately needed for utilizing corn gluten meal. So we'll mention glyphosate, and glyphosate is a product that's utilized in a number of different products. It is in Roundup. We also will see it sometimes in other groups such as OrthoClean. And this is one that kills existing weeds. So it is something that you can apply to that weed species to kill it. It's going to move into the root systems of that plant and die. But it's non-selective. It's going to target anything it comes into contact with. It's systemic in that regard. It's very good for perennial weed control, which is why this might be the one that you look at, especially if it's an area you're thinking of preparing. There are certainly new growing areas, might be where you utilize it, a severe weed population, but also even consider more of like a balanced approach where you may utilize it in some parts of your growing area and maybe not as many. There are certain types of glyphosate that can be used in the vegetable garden in the growing season. It depends highly on that product. And I would stress that you need to look at the label to see whether you can use that product or not based on what's growing or what hasn't been growing just yet. You know, there's some products of glyphosate that will stress that, you know, this plant could be planted, your vegetables could be planted 1 to 3 days after application onto any weed species nearby. Another thing to stress is that for annual plants, you will probably not see any sort of killing of the annual plants until 2 to 4 days after application. And for perennials, sometimes it's 7 to 10 days. This one needs to be applied when temperatures are above 60 degrees. Spot treatment is sometimes possible and some folks will utilize it. You just gotta be very, very cautious of this product and also know which one it is that you're purchasing. So it needs to be listed for use in that vegetable garden. There are also soaps and acids. These tend to have a bit more of an organic approach to them. These include products that have acetic acid in them, so very high concentrations of vinegar. Iron sulfate is also one that you might see. Soaps tend to act as their surfactant, so it's allowing for the product to kind of cling on to the actual species itself. It disrupts the cuticle, it burns the leaves, but you need full weed coverage most of the case. You need to apply it completely all over that weed. It doesn't tend to be as effective on perennials, so just kind of keep that in mind that some of these are not as effective and more effective on the annuals themselves. But because of that non-selective, if it gets on your vegetables, it's liable to cause some damage. There's others out there too. Hot boiled water, folks will sometimes try this. It tends to be fairly ineffective. Yet again, it's kind of up to you whether you want to do it or not, but know that it's not always effective. You will see recipes for making your own Dawn dish detergent combined with acetic acid, combined with other ingredients. We usually don't recommend this. One of the reasons being that sometimes the acetic acid or the vinegar is a very low potency, and you need sometimes a very high concentration of vinegar. We also just don't find it to be as effective. You may also see products that have clove oil, citric acid, lemongrass oil. These are not as effective on perennial weeds, may be very effective on your annual weeds. But in thinking of it, none of these tend to be systemic, and really repeated application covering the whole plant can sometimes be very much necessary. So we'll get into some weed profiles tonight, just kind of briefly. I just want to go through a couple of these that I have. I may not get through all of them, but we'll try to get through some of these. You know, their dandelion, yet again, it's going to be perennial weed. And it is one where I would say the main takeaway is that if you're going to try to control it, keep the seeds from entering into the seed bank. And you also need to try to remove as much of that taproot as you can, because it's going to keep coming back season after season. So it means that for a dandelion such as this, I certainly would try to remove as much of the taproot as I can. And if I couldn't, I would still aim to get about 2 to 3 inches, if not more. That would be one to really consider thinking about. Herbicides could be utilized for this one too, although you might want to wait till the fall, as it tends to be a little more effective for fall application. This is bindweed. So you have 2 bindweeds, hedge as well as field. This is yet again another perennial weed. So it's going to produce these vining characteristics from its rhizomes. This is one where you probably kind of want to fall back to how far that vine is and back to the center of the plant. And you may find that just repeated pulling, cutting back, even mowing could work for this one. I think it really depends on how far it's certainly spread. It is in that morning glory family, so it has those nice white flowers and characteristics to it. But just know that over time, because of its perennial tendencies, it could become really widespread, and you may need to really think about managing that. Mulching could potentially help, although if it has that vining characteristic, it may be a little hard to do. 2 that you might be seeing right now is yellowwood sorrel. You also might be seeing henbit or some of the other purple weeds that are out there. Occasionally dead nettle is also one that looks pretty similar to henbit. Both of these have appeared in the last couple of weeks in northern Illinois. I would say based on their plant structure in their root systems, they're pretty easy to actually remove by hand. Wood sorrel is a perennial and it will produce seeds, while henbit is going to be an annual. And so it'd be very quick to remove that one by hand. In fact, really most of them would be pretty easy to remove by hand, the sorrel as well as the henbit. You may have clover that's popped up, clover, white, red, kind of all of that group. Over time can really build up a population and become a little bit invasive. It's one thing when you see it just starting to grow the previous year, and as it gets bigger and widespread with its matted system, it could really take over. And with this one, you may find some luck with mulching, but it also may be one that really works well with just some hand pulling and removal. On the right here is a representative of the pigweeds family. This is red root pigweed. You may also see ornamental amaranth at some of the home and garden centers, which is within that same family. And the ornamental one can look, it's very nice quality to it, but it could be one that over time could be a little invasive, and you might want to really be cautious of it. If you do see pigweed in your current growing area, the best suggestion that we have is to do some hand removal, because it's so big, and yet the amount of seeds it can produce. You may be growing a lot of pigweed for a lot of years. So certainly kind of hand removal, kind of down to the base, making sure that it does not go to seed, it does not flower, is really what you're after here. We talked already a little bit about common chickweed. So this is one you're probably seeing a lot of already. I'd say you're probably starting to enter in potentially a flowering period. So it may be very important for you to go ahead and remove this from your growing area, especially as it starts to seed. The other thing that we note with chickweed is that it will germinate spring, summer, late fall. So pretty common in other parts. Try to limit the seed distribution. And this is also one that really thrives on moist conditions. So if there's a way for you to create a drier area, this would be very helpful. But this is probably going to be one of the main early season weeds that you might really see. And yet, as you see here, March 31st, there was, it had already flowered very quickly. It does sometimes look like a mouse ear chickweed. That's another one, but it has, the mouse ears have a fuzzy kind of leaf to them. There's a number of different thistles: Canada, bull, musk, sow. These can be both annual, perennial, and biennial. So it really depends on having that proper thistle ID can really be quite helpful for you to determine how you need to manage it. Many of them are starting to really germinate in the last couple of weeks. That's what I've really noticed around my growing area. And so you may have to go ahead and start removing these by hand. I think it's also very important to ensure that this one does not go to seed, because it can become very annoying. Annoying isn't necessarily the right word, but certainly having that many of them over time can be a bit of a problem. So hand removal will be your best strategy right now, if you could. And then you may, especially with a bull or a musk, you might be able to get away with mowing it right before it starts to flower, if it has now its second year with it. Canada, the one you see here is Canada thistle. I need to mow prior to flowering for multiple years. So this is one where it's at, I can actually remove it by hand. And yet if it was a very big area of it, I would probably need to come in here and mow multiple times as it gets bigger. Our two grasses, large smooth crabgrass is one type, or two different types, and then we have quack grasses. So quack grass is going to be a perennial, and this is a grass that is currently starting to grow. We've yet to really see crabgrass develop just yet, but it is one that it will happen. It'll happen over time. Crabgrass is an annual grass, so it has no rhizomes whatsoever, but the quack grass has the rhizomes, and that's how it's spreading and moving through your growing area. Because of the way the structure is for quackgrass, it's very hard to control, very hard to do hand removal. And it's also one that if you had a patch in an area that was quackgrass and you came in with a tiller and you tilled it under, you have basically created more problems for you. It's not actually going to be managed in a mowing way. One of the main indicators of quackgrass is these little, you can kind of see it just slightly, this one distinction where you kind of have a bit of an edge here where the leaf structure is. That's one characteristic that this is quackgrass. Along with, if you were to dig into the soil, you would see some pretty substantial root systems that you may be able to remove, you may not be able to remove. Hand removal is more possible for our crabgrass. That's one that you could certainly get away with it. Maybe some heavy mulch layers would also help a bit if you mowed these patches down, especially for something like crabgrass. A pre-emergent could also work well for crabgrass very early on in its season. It's not going to work for quackgrass. So from a weed grass management approach, you may have two different directions. Those perennial grasses that need to be managed in a different style than the annual grasses need to. Garlic mustard is one that is heavily, a very strong concern right now is the movement of garlic mustard and its tendencies to really start to take over some of these areas. And you might have this on your property, and hopefully you don't have too much of it because it's very hard to control and to really eradicate. It is a biennial, so it's going to need 2 years of growth in order to produce seeds. This one that you see here, this is its second year of growth. And so it's now producing flowers, it's starting to produce seeds. I need to get this under control. I am fortunate in my growing area that I don't have as much garlic mustard, but certainly in more wooded areas, more native areas even, you may see heavy amount of garlic mustard. And certainly it's much easier to control it its first year than it is sometimes in that second year. It fully can take 2 to 5 years for eradication. And yet again, that's getting back to its growth cycles. It is one that's fairly easy for hand removal. I find that, at least with the ones that I have encountered, is that it's very easy for me to remove this by hand and destroy it. You might also, in some way, try to think about cutting the seed stalks back to the ground level. It still is going to have that root system underground, but realistically, that might be one strategy to kind of keep it from growing much more. I would say you probably still want to combine this with some landscape fabric in order to really kind of block it out and keep it from developing further, because sometimes it can, even though you've cut it all the way back. And certainly an herbicide might be a strategy here too. Ground ivy, creeping Charlie, another one that's starting to wake up and starting to move around. You saw it in one of our photos earlier for the strawberry beds. It's perennial, it's creeping characteristics. It's very aggressive in shading areas and moist areas. And the way that its creeping stem is moving makes it very different from the henbit and some of those other ones that it may be identified as. It does tend to be a little more common on lawns. However, you may find it comes into your vegetable garden. Repeated hand removal is a good strategy. Actually increasing the sunlight if you could, and maybe this gets back to where you're actually placing your garden. And then herbicides might also be a good strategy. Some of these other preventive measures that I've not mentioned, such as mulching and so forth, might also work for some of these weeds, depending on which weed it is. Our final one for tonight is poison ivy. And this is one that has already started to send up some growth already this year. Kathy, who might or might not be on the calls, emailed me about this already, so I thought I'd include it in tonight's presentation. And one of the challenges with properly IDing it is that the growth characteristics can sometimes look a little bit different depending on the time of the season. So it could be as a shrub type, could be vining characteristic. Like many of the other perennial vegetables, perennial weeds, it moves underground by rhizomes. So that's how it's moving. And you need to control above ground as well as below ground. Many of us are familiar with the actual leaf shape, this compound leaf with 3 leaflets. It tends to kind of lack kind of a jagged edge or shape to it, but it can also be misidentified as Virginia creeper, box elder seedlings as well. There are herbicides available. There could be careful hand removal, cut back to ground level, but it's one to be really mindful of controlling and really making sure that you're getting this in place. Some folks will try to dig up small plants and discard them, but if you've left any part of that rhizome behind, it's liable to still be a problem for you. So realistically, it may be very hard to control this one. So we're starting to wrap up for tonight. I will have resources to send you tomorrow with a number of guides, as well as both the links to those weed ID websites that I mentioned. I think one of my ways of really thinking about weed management in this vegetable garden is to just know your enemies. I mean, we always want to know who our enemies are, but certainly from a weed standpoint, knowing your enemies and having them properly ID'd is really crucial to helping you get your weeds under control, or help you determine if there's areas to avoid even. There could certainly be growing areas that there's a heavy infestation of perennial weeds where the vegetable garden just should not be situated. So having the ID is crucial here. Think about how you can remove a resource the weed ultimately needs, whether that's sunlight, whether that is water, whether that is space, but is there a way for you to remove it that it can severely impact that weed? And some of the ways that it might work for annuals might be pretty easy, but when we think about perennials, sometimes the strategy is that I'm going to mow that perennial down, and then I'm going to come through with a tarp or with landscape fabric and keep that weed from getting the sunlight that it needs, basically starving those perennial weeds. And that could be a strategy you consider there, and that's removing a resource that it needed. Try to start strong each season, try to think about prevention. before, during, and after the garden season. I think that we sometimes forget that, weed management is ultimately from spring all the way up to frost. Some folks might even say that weed management sometimes begins in the wintertime. But ultimately, during this growing season and after, it's really important. And then at the end of the day, really try to do your best for minimizing the seed entry. Keeping seeds from entering into the soil is really crucial here and really helpful when it comes to keeping them from ultimately being a problem. So that is my email as well as my phone number. As mentioned, I will send you a resources tomorrow with some of the things we've talked about tonight. You will also receive an evaluation, and would just encourage you to fill out that evaluation, as we're using the evaluation to really think more critically on what types of webinars you all would like, how long you would like them, when you would like them, so forth and so forth. So we always appreciate getting some feedback there. I'm going to turn my camera on. I'm going to take a sip of water, and I'm going to look at your chat box. All right, so there was a statement. I love violets and I let them grow under my trees, but they're taking over my vegetable garden and my stone patio, interplanting with sedums. What might be some suggestions here? So yet again, with the violets, it might be that you need to start off by truing some hand removal, and then from there, maybe even cutting them back might be a strategy that you might even be able to do to kind of, cut them back and then maybe cover them up with a mulch or covering them up with something to maybe starve them off to potentially keep them from spreading. I don't think that violets are necessarily ones that are going to spread underground or spread above ground, but that would just be some comment where maybe cutting them back, coming in with a mulch, covering them up might be a helpful solution to keep it. When it comes to them getting into the sedums and some of those other locations, that's where it gets a little bit harder to actually do. And that one, you might actually have to put a little bit more work into it. Someone mentioned a lot of violets everywhere this year. Yeah, we're seeing a lot of populations are really showing up. There was a question about to me, how can I get rid of common mugwort or common wood? So this is one that I just noticed I have a population in my backyard. And what I have noticed so far is that hand removal is really quick with it, at least where mine is growing for this mugwort. The other thing that you might consider is coming through with a mower, chopping that down, and then coming in with potentially some kind of mulch layer. Herbicides could also be utilized for mugwort as well, or for the common woodworm too. But I would come in there and maybe either do hand removal, cut it back, and then try to cover it with a mulch or a tarp and see if that works for you. There was a question, what's the recommended means to remove quack grass? So, with the way that it is perennial, herbicides could be an option. I would say that you've got to have some way to remove a resource. And it could be that, as you've heard, I'm saying, cut it back, cover it with a tarp, and see if that could help out quite a bit with it. Quackgrass might also benefit a little bit from some soil solarization. That could be a strategy for it later on in August, where you come in and you maybe take those plastic and you layer it on top, and potentially that reduces that. But because of its underground rhizomes and the way that quackgrass spreads, it's going to be very hard to just target the above ground without targeting the below ground. And so it could be you're cutting it back, you're coming in with a tarp, and hopefully that maybe will start to kind of suck away some of the nutrients they need, and basically is starving it at that point. And that's a strategy that works quite well for a lot of perennial plants. And that would probably be what I suggest, just because those root systems are pretty deep. There was a question, is there any problem with leaving landscape fabric on the garden area all year long, from end of season through winter? There doesn't tend to be. I think that if you are, keeping that landscape fabric season after season, which is typically what most of us do, it should be okay as far as, it not breaking down. From a vegetable standpoint, if you kept that landscape fabric in place season after season, you may find that you need to really want to address crop rotation in there. So that would be the one caveat, is that if you're using landscape fabric, it's staying in place season after season, you want to really think more critically about your crop rotation and ensuring that you're doing some crop rotation in there. Yeah, so John and Cindy stated with poison ivy, be careful, even a dog can pass the oils on to humans. Yeah, there's a lot of concern with those oils, and you need to be very cautious of anything that's coming into contact with them, especially as you start removing them by hand, especially as you might be using any types of tools to eradicate that poison ivy. John and Cindy further stated too, don't burn poison ivy. It will put oils into the air. Yeah. So I'll send you some resources on poison ivy, but yeah, we're still at a place of like very cautious with controlling it and how you manage it too. There was a question, how can I get rid of aphids that are attacking my herbs? So right now, if your herbs are outdoors, it may just be that right now they're not finding any sort of, you're not finding any kind of insect predators that can go after these aphids. So that could be one of the problems there, is that if the herbs are growing inside and you have an aphid infestation, it can be very hard to control them. Outdoors, a plant, herbs outdoors, they're usually relying on some predators. Sometimes some of those soaps can be useful as far as like putting some soaps on the herbs, and occasionally some of these soaps are listed for herbs that can be quite useful. I would say if your herbs are outdoors, hopefully it will the aphids should start to reduce as more insect predators begin to appear. That would be my main suggestion. There's a question, how do you incorporate leftover wood mulch in the garden after the growing season? So you can do a couple of things, Christy. You could incorporate it, kind of going through there and kind of letting it break down and turn it into the soil, or you could just keep layering that wood chip mulch up and up. Over time, it is going to break down. It is going to be incorporated, but certainly it's not going to necessarily incorporate in a single season. So it would be two strategies. And as you can tell, that is kind of the problem with the wood mulch, is that it can be a great mulch layer to help with weed control. And yet, if you decide to till it under, you now have maybe turned the soil up and you now may have exposed the wood chips. And so what you might do, if you're thinking of incorporating into the soil, is wait until the fall, or even like, that period of November. That might be when you actually incorporate it into the soil, because by then potentially some of those weed seeds would not germinate if they're annuals. And potentially also too, you might be able to have done a good job of making sure that weeds haven't germinated. So it could be two approaches. If you want to incorporate into the soil, probably wait until mid-November. And then if you're thinking of just kind of layering it, that could also be a good strategy too. Creeping Charlie news. I don't know if I have Creeping Charlie news, Ron. This is one that is very hard to control. I mean, especially as it starts spreading to the vegetable garden. I would say right now is a good time to try to remove it by hand as much as you can. It's also one that, as you already saw, it's moving around. We're seeing a lot of it too. But because of its kind of tendency, hand removal would be a really good strategy. I don't think it's going to work too well for mulch. You could try mulch. I'm a little concerned with the mulch though, just with its vining characteristics. There was a question, is there some wording I should look for on wood mulch that indicates decreasing weed seeds in it? That's a good question. I don't know of any. I don't know of anything in particular. Let me see what I can find out, because there's just different wood species, that there could be some wood species that maybe are a little bit better for a better wood choice mulch compared to others. Would really kind of depend on it. So let me see what I can find out, and I'll message you back. I'll send it out to the group there. Carmen asked, how to control mushrooms growing in the mulch? I would say that one of the things to maybe is to try to lightly turn it up every once in a while to keep it from being as moist. That would certainly be one problem that you might encounter. Another thing you might consider is doing a mixture of wood mulch and newspaper, or wood mulch and even straw. And that might allow for a little bit more air circulation to move in, and hopefully that might inhibit some of the mushrooms that you might be seeing. So that might be an idea, is to try to actually incorporate a couple of different mulches that would potentially address that moisture issue, which is really causing that mushroom growth that you might be seeing. All right, any more questions? I know we're a little over time. I just want to make sure I've gotten these. And as I've gone through some of your questions tonight, just know I'm going to double check my answers. We always want to double check our answers for some of these, or some of your, especially some of these ones that are a little bit narrow. So I'll double check answers and make sure that you get that information back. All right, so I don't see any more questions. You'll get an email with more resources, and you'll get that tomorrow, as well as the recording of this. Thanks for being a part of tonight's presentation. Thanks for being a part of previous presentations. Good luck with weed management this year. I'm right there with you. I got to manage my weeds as well. All right.